a
We,
very full house today. Jock
yeah,
is here,
nice.
Danny's here.
Excellent.
Uh, without further ado, I feel like we can get started. We have amazing guest today, Hannah Stark. I personally know her. We reconnected after grad school last year because she's doing amazing work at Preservation and Alliance. And I attended their event on how to revive the roundhouse in on near Chinatown. I'll let her talk about what she's doing on the realm of advocacy for historic preservation in Philadelphia now. And they recently did a really amazing report. If you haven't seen it, you can scan a QR code and download it. I think we sent out links to both the Preservation Committee and the Housing Committee. We really want this to be a close collaboration with people of different interests and dive in different fields. So, Hannah, if you can get started, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be invited to this. We're super excited about the report, and I'm just really glad to be here today. Um, I am Hannah Stark. I'm the Director of Policy and Communications at the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia. If you aren't familiar with the Preservation Alliance, we are a member-supported education and advocacy nonprofit whose mission is to actively promote the appreciation, protection, and appropriate use and development of the region's historic buildings, communities, and landscapes. And today I'm going to be sharing a little bit of findings from our recent report entitled Growing Through Preservation, the Economic Impact of Historic Preservation in Philadelphia. And I really hope that you'll be able to use this report as an advocacy tool as professionals. And I want to start a little bit about reframing about how we think about preservation, especially for this audience, which is more focused on the environment and sustainability. Preservation is often talked about as something that is more cultural or aesthetic, about history or architecture, and that is all true. But it's also more than that. It's economic, it's environmental, and it's deeply tied to how our cities function and evolve. So I think Philadelphia is a particularly interesting case just because of the sheer scale of existing building stock that we have. This is a city that we're not just preserving individual isolated landmarks. We really have historic buildings embedded across our entire city. And so let me advance my slides. So for the report that I'll be drawing on from today, it was prepared for us last fall by Place Economics, which is an international firm which over 30 years of experience doing this type of thorough and robust data analysis, really at the intersection of economics and heritage. And we have long admired their work, and we were really excited about working with them and finding out some of these data points that we really wanted to drill down on. And so for the report had three main areas: demographics and historic districts, housing affordability, and the economic impact of rehabilitation projects. Today, just kind of based on this audience's interest, I'm going to focus a little bit less on the demographic side and more so on the intersection of preservation and sustainability through housing and the impact of rehabilitation projects. But if you are interested, this report does have a whole chapter that we're not really going to dive into today as much. I do encourage you to check it out. It's 65 pages, but it's very graphic rich. I think Place Economics does a fantastic job of making reports that are very approachable, which is one of the reasons that we really want to get this report in front of as many audiences as possible. So I'm really glad that we'll get to do that today. And so I kind of want to start by saying something that I think a lot of you on the call probably understand, but I think that is not fully integrated into, common understanding, but that is that preservation is climate action. When we demolish buildings, we're not just removing structures, we're also disregarding all of the embodied energy that went into creating them. And I know talking with your co-chairs before this, you guys have done a lot of deep dives on embodied carbon and embodied energy. So I know you're all familiar with what I'm talking about, but this is from the materials to the labor and the carbon emissions associated with the extraction, manufacturing, and construction of the buildings. And also, demolition, as we all know, creates a significant amount of landfill waste, and new construction, again, just requires more new materials, which just means more emissions. And by contrast, reuse avoids both sides of that equation. It avoids demolition emissions and it reduces the need for new material production. One of the interesting things that we see in the data is that historic rehabilitation projects tend to be more labor intensive and less material intensive than new construction. And this has economic implications that I'll talk about a little bit later on, but it also has those environmental implications that you are all aware of. And, if more of your investment is going into labor rather than materials, we're inherently reducing carbon footprint associated with that construction. So, I know you're probably all familiar with the saying, the greenest building is the one that already exists, but that really is something that we truly believe, and especially in a city like Philadelphia, with just our large amount of historic building stock, we really think that this is a, large climate asset if we choose to treat it that way. So now let's dive a little bit into some of the findings. So I want to start by talking about and helping to look at like some of the numbers that Place Economics was able to find. And, I think right now we specifically chose to look at housing because we just know that there is an affordable housing need for our city. So for the next couple slides, this is going to be focused primarily on residential buildings. So just to make sure that that is clear, this is not all buildings in the city, but when you're looking at our residential buildings, 67% of those buildings were constructed pre-1950. And, when we're thinking about reducing emissions, most of that work can happen through retrofitting and reusing existing buildings, not just through new construction. We have these row homes that are so ubiquitous everywhere, but they have a lot of inherent advantages as well. They're very dense, which supports walkability. That in turn reduces transportation emissions. They share party walls, which can improve energy efficiency. They're very adaptable, which we've seen that they've been occupied over generations. So it's really not just, I think we're lucky in Philadelphia just because of this large number of row home buildings, that it's not just significant landmarks. We're able to invest in this huge portion of the city's housing stock. And so what Place Economics did when they were looking at our residential building stock, they wanted to form a study area where 70% of the housing units in that census block were built pre-1950. So if you look at the map here, the areas shaded in that dark blue are going to be areas where predominantly the housing units are pre-1950. And I want to emphasize units because you'll notice that there's a large portions of like Center City, for instance, that people would say like, oh, like isn't Society Hill like has tons of pre-1950s row homes, but we're talking about units rather than buildings here. So if there's an apartment building that was built in the last 5 years, that is 120 units, that can shift that. So we're just talking about the unit count here rather than the building scale. So I think I just want to make that clear as we go into some of the rest of the data here. And when we're looking at this old housing study area, this encompasses 50% of our pre-1950s housing units. And within the study area itself, 81 of those units were built pre-1950. And so, again, this is just like scratching the surface of what the report talks about.
Okay, you need to not do that now.
What was that? Okay, I don't think that was me. um, but I want to talk like really dig down into what Place Economics was able to find, and that is that older buildings, these older housing units, tend to provide what we all call naturally occurring affordable housing, smaller units with lower rents and lower property values, in turn having lower property taxes. And what we found through this report is that median rents in the older housing study area was about 9% lower than the rest of Philadelphia, and that the median owner cost in the older home study area is about 11% lower. So we think that this affordability advantage of older housing already exists. And we think this has a really important implication that when we demolish these older buildings that have this inherently affordable housing, we're also removing this. And in many cases, it's being replaced with higher cost units. So we really think that decisions about preservation and rehabilitation aren't just about design or history, it's also about making sure that people get to stay in the neighborhoods where they live. And I think it makes this question of how we retrofit buildings even more important. And so now I want to dive into the impact of historic tax credit rehabilitation projects. And again, this is, I think, some of the most illuminating sections of the report. I do just want to preface again, just because Place Economics does such a great job of their methodology, that I just want to make sure it's really clear like what we're talking about here. So we are specifically looking at historic tax credit rehabilitation projects. So this is not any rehabilitation or retrofit of any older or existing city. Rather, this is just the projects that actually took advantage of either the federal or state historic preservation tax credit program. If you aren't familiar with the federal or state historic tax credit programs, they are only applicable to buildings listed on the National Register or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So these are historic buildings that have a documented historic significance and have been certified that way through the Park Service. So it's not just any older building that's eligible, but with a city like Philadelphia, we do have a large number of buildings that are able to take advantage of this credit. And the reason that Place Economics only looked at the the rehab projects that went through the tax credit program is because the requirements of using that program, there's so much data that you have to use. So there's just a wealth of data that we have that for a lot of projects that just go through the city, unfortunately, we don't have that same level of data. So these are just the tax credit projects. And if you are at all interested in the tax credits, it is something that I could talk about forever. I think that they are such a great incentive to invest in our historic buildings. Right now, they are only tied to income producing properties. So homeowners of historic buildings are not eligible. And I could really get into the weeds with it. But I think what is most important for this audience is that since 2010, there have been nearly 300 tax credit projects, which puts us ahead of many of the other large cities in the country. If you look at that, we are by far the largest user of the federal historic tax credit, and that has represented over $3.5 billion in investment. And you'll see this little acronym here called QREs. And if you aren't familiar with the tax credit program, that is just qualified rehabilitation expenditures. So that is the actual dollars that are going into these projects as part of the historic preservation work. I also want to say I can see that the chat is going, but I can't read it right now with my slides up. So hopefully no one's asking like pressing questions in there because I won't be able to see them until I take my slides down. So just sorry in advance if there's anything interesting going on in there. And I also think what was really interesting for us was that the projects that are using this rehabilitation incentive are a lot of smaller projects. Actually, the largest you can see here as part of this pie graph, it's primarily, or the largest chunk, not primarily, but about 40% is less than $1 million projects. And you can see that the over $100 million projects are the smallest sliver there at just 2% of the projects that are taking advantage of this. So I think that is something that we always think that this can be really well utilized by those small dollar projects, and that historic tax credit shouldn't only be used in the larger projects. So we were really glad to see that that is, in fact, the case. And then this is where we get lots of that data here. So from those tax credit rehabs, there are 2,500 jobs created each year just from historic tax credit rehabilitation projects alone. That translates to over 140 million in labor income, which again is also 8.1 million in local tax revenue. And because we know how important housing is right now, we also asked Place Economics just to see from those 271 projects, how many housing units were developed, how many former industrial sites now supply housing. And we were able to find that in this 14-year period, there were about 8,000 units of housing in previously. So again, these were not housing to begin with. These are brand new housing units added to the city. And also, I think this data is really great, thinking about how for every $100 invested in the rehabilitation of a historic building, this can generate $45 in additional economic activity in Philadelphia. And to kind of illustrate what that looks like, if you are paying, you're going to get mill work at a lumber yard, and that worker then is going to get lunch and a haircut. That is that additional economic benefit, the money changing hands going back into the general economic ecosystem. And this is just in Philadelphia. So if you're using out of town suppliers, this is just money that's going back to the city of Philadelphia itself. And again, there's this acronym of QREs that you'll see, because there are obviously, when you're thinking about historic rehabilitation projects, there are going to be expenditures that are not going directly to historic preservation. And just by the way that the tax credit works, you don't get the tax credit, let's say, on site improvements, if you're adding a parking lot or if you're doing landscaping or other things like that that are not related to the historic building itself. So I think it's also really important to note that outside of just the qualified rehabilitation expenditures, there is another $42 invested, but that can also, generate jobs, labor income, and local taxes. So what you saw on the slide before, those stats were only based on the actual dollars that went into the rehabilitation rather than everything else that, as you all know, goes into a project like this. And we really wanted to look at how historic rehabilitation, if it was its own industry, kind of stacked up against other common industries in Philadelphia. And I think what's really interesting is looking at the number of jobs that it creates for $1 million invested in rehabilitation. You're getting more than 6 jobs, which is much more than many other industries except restaurants. And you're also getting high paying jobs. And I think that is really important as well, when you're thinking about how, if we were our own industry, we stack up against other common industries in Philadelphia, because we think preservation is not anti-development. It is a form of development, and we think it is a significant one in the city. And I think that brings us to the most interesting and challenging part of this conversation, which is how preservation and sustainability actually intersect in practice. And I think there is, we don't need to go ahead right away to discussion. But I think that, there is sometimes perceived tensions between historic integrity and energy performance. And, a lot of that can come back to the historic tax credit guidelines, which, might limit certain types of interventions that you're able to do on a building. But I think when we're thinking about performance, there's definitely a way that we can integrate new strategies that complement the rehabilitation of our historic buildings. We have all of we have lots of different strategies. And I think that I'm really interested in hearing from, this group, how we can, think about being complementary of each other and starting to bridge this gap between preservation and sustainability. I think it would be great if we were able to kind of like see them as two sides of the same coin, just because we do have this amazing building stock, all of our row homes across the city that could really serve as almost like a sort of testing ground for these different sorts of approaches. And I think that everyone on this call has a lot of influence in this space. You have so much technical knowledge about materials, systems, and interventions that can really shape how adaptive reuse of our historic buildings perform over time. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities for us to push forward together. And I hope that the data that's in this report can be used as part of these conversations, whether we're talking about adaptive reuse, taking underutilized buildings from industrial to commercial and finding new uses for them. We're also at the Alliance, we're really interested in this idea of deconstruction, as an alternative to demolition, to salvage materials, to reduce the waste and rethinking life cycles of these building components. So I think that personally, I would really love to see how we can better align our preservation review processes with climate goals, so they aren't seen as competing opportunities, but rather an opportunity to design interventions that respect our historic fabric while improving performance. And I think that why I was so excited to be invited to this is, I sometimes feel like we get a little bit siloed and we can get isolated and not talk to each other. So I think this opportunity to collaborate between architects, preservationists, sustainability advocates, and policymakers is really key about how we think about the future of our city and all of the buildings that we have here. So I know that was kind of a lot of data to throw at you, but I just want to kind of close with, I think our existing buildings here in Philadelphia are a sustainability asset. Preservation, hope, as you'll see through this report, you now know that it supports both economic development and housing affordability, and that this new, kind of this next frontier is all about integration, bringing preservation and climate strategies together in a more intentional way. And I hope that, when you think about our historic buildings, it's not just the past, but it's also an asset and it's an opportunity to have a more sustainable future. And, I think I'd love to kind of open it up for some discussion from this group, hearing about what are the tensions that you see between preservation and sustainability in your work, and where do you think policy or practice can evolve to better support these goals? As I said at the top, I really do a lot of the Preservation Alliance's advocacy work. So I'm a little bit more of like a policy wonk than a, building systems professional, but I would love to hear from you all who do this in the field about how we can support the work, the great work that we all do. And yeah, I think that's kind of where I'll close it now. And I am eager to see what was being dropped in the chat because I couldn't. So I will take down my slides if that's okay with you all.
Perfect. Thanks, Hannah. All right. Now everyone can unmute. Paul, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I wanted to thank you, Hannah. This was great. Had a nice conversation yesterday, and it's great to continue the conversation because we all love Philadelphia, and the thing that makes it so great is that we have these beautiful old buildings, and they need to be modernized, and we live in a contemporary world regardless of whether we live in a 200-year-old row home or not. And if they don't get modernized, then the city dies. My question for you is about the tax credits. So tax credits, of course, only go to people who pay taxes. And so the city's not doing this, right? They might hire a private, public-private partnership or a private developer. It seems to me that as part of that development package, the historical preservation needs to be, well, in order to get the tax credits, I worked on a big project, and the tax credits were 20% of the I don't know if it's construction cost or project cost. I don't know exactly what it was, but people took it very seriously because they did not want to lose that 20%. And it was incumbent on both the design team and the construction team that those standards were paid, attention, and that they met the standards, because there would be big trouble if, $40 million of the project cost didn't meet the tax credits. But my guess my question was how about how do we ensure that these historic buildings are renovated and upgraded and improved in a way that's sort of not a short term, but is a long term, result, so we continue the use of these great old buildings. I know it's complicated, and it probably has to do with the writing of the RFPs and public policy and things like that. So, I mean, is the Preservation Alliance, or who's doing that work in Philadelphia, for example?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And thanks, Paul, for pointing that out about the tax credits. Because, yeah, if you are doing a project with a nonprofit or a public entity, you would have to form some sort of partnership where you're able to syndicate the tax credits. So a lot of times, financial institutions can buy those tax credits from nonprofits. So yeah, that's a good point to point out. And I think for the second part of your question about who's doing that work, I think a lot of individuals are right now, but I think that a lot of it, like I said, is kind of getting siloed, and there's not really that large institutional conversations that need to happen to actually make change. Because I know, right now, if you're doing I think also it's good to point out that if you're doing like a project on a designated historic structure, that's going to look a little bit different than if you're just working on a building that happens to be older. And I think that I sometimes those guidelines, you don't have to follow the same guidelines if you're just working on like an older building that does not happen to be historic. But if you are working on a building that has, regulatory overview from the historical commission or from the Park Service for any reason, I don't think those guidelines are really evolved enough to take advantage of the latest technology and best practices that you all are able to implement. And I think being able to showcase, you know, projects that have done it and done it well go a really long way to kind of modernizing what those, guidelines or best practices could be. So I don't have a great answer to that, but I do think that those conversations need to continue to happen. So that's again why I'm really excited to be here with you all, because I think you have such an amazing skill set and knowledge base that sometimes preservationists don't have. We have kind of complementary skills, but we don't have the same knowledge.
Katrina?
Hi, good afternoon. Hannah, thanks so much for presenting today. And I'm just stepping into our AIA Advocacy Committee co-chair this year. And I'm curious about like policies that the Preservation Alliance is working on. For instance, we here, like within our group, we've been trying to not just be responsive to what's happening in City Hall, but try to be more proactive and actually advocating for things that are pertinent to what we believe, and working with council members on those issues. And I was curious if there's anything that you're all doing that we could maybe align on or could find support in each other to advocate more for at City Hall.
So I will say the first thing that came to mind is not city advocacy that we're doing, but we've been working on a state for the instance, the state historic tax credit program. We've been the co-lead of the Pennsylvania Historic Tax Credit Coalition because we have heard from a lot of, developers and consultants in the city who use specifically the state tax credit program, that program really could be strengthened and improved. So one of our main policy priorities going back for over 4 years now has been working to improve the state program. So there is a statewide coalition that we lead to improve that. And I think that we had one of our, 2 years ago, we were successful in raising the amount of dollars that the DCED can give out in the state historic tax credit from 5 million to 20 million. But unfortunately, the way the legislation is written is that right now they can only give that out in $500,000 increments. And when you're thinking about a capital stack, $500,000 doesn't really go far. A lot of other states, and even the federal program, they're not capped. So we've been trying, and our bill passed the House of Representatives last June to raise that per project cap to at least 1.5 million. So that is something that we're very active on that right now. Like I said, we had it pass the state house. We're trying to get a hearing in the Senate Finance Committee. So there's like a lot of tangible advocacy steps that if you're interested in kind of the tax credit world that we're really involved with right now. But at the city level, I think your point about being proactive is really great. Right now, we're kind of in a little bit of a reactive position. There was a bill introduced in City Council back in November that would kind of change how the designation process works. So if you want to add a building to the historic register, kind of that process right now. There's a new bill that would modify that, and we're a little bit concerned about that. So we've been participating in conversations around that bill. And those are kind of the two main active policy conversations that we're having. We would be happy to have the AIA's support on that. We do have a really good means of communications with the Historic Preservation Committee, but it would be really great to have folks on the advocacy subcommittee participate in either the tax credit coalition or some of the conversations around the new bill in City Council as well.
Yeah, that would be great, Hannah. I know, so we have looked, if it's the same bill that's coming up to hearing in April, the Historic Preservation Committee is reviewing it now and will be speaking at the hearing. So I think something like that and anything new that's upcoming be great to, stay in touch and make sure that we're aligned on kind of what our positions are as much as possible, to help support each other.
Yeah.
So that would be great. And yeah, let's keep the conversation going, especially I want to connect with our committee and, start thinking about ways we can be proactive with City Hall.
Awesome. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks.
Katrina. It's very impressive how Hannah, your report talks about jobs and economics, and those are the things that a lot of politicians care about. Jonathan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a brief comment and a question, I guess, because first, obviously, thanks, Hannah. This was really great. And I appreciate your question about what are some of the challenges between sustainability and preservation. And I guess what I would say is I think the way you framed it is really the way I hope we're all thinking about it now, which is that there isn't a conflict. There's sort of a collaboration. I know that sort of historically there was some tension where some sustainability people might have said, well, we should build new, more efficient buildings than those old ones. But I think that's kind of old news now, that it's really we're fighting against business as usual, which is to knock things down and build new things that are not that good. And, a better case, which is, building or rebuilding and reusing. And the carbon story is obviously a really easy one. The question that I guess I had, and this is a higher level one than Katrina asked, is I sort of feel like in the sustainability world, the current administration has sort of put a lot of pressure to redefine sustainability in a way that's different than we've seen. And I'm curious whether the same thing is seen in preservation, or whether you're just it's sort of a curiosity that I have to say, because I know that all the things that I've been reading about are sort of local type of things, which may be immune to that a little bit. But I'm just curious what's out there. That's my question. And thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I think if we're looking at kind of zooming out to like the federal level and some of the changes, about specifically around environmental review, because a lot of times historic preservation is looped into environmental reviews. And, with the changing of different EPA standards, we are seeing kind of the changing of the the threshold for historic significance as well. Like there were definitely in previous, since historic preservation is part of environmental review, there were definitely more times that, if there was any presence of historic buildings, those were always considered. And I think we are seeing that threshold is getting higher for what types of buildings is going to be considered in that. So yeah, we are definitely, the preservation community in general is thinking about how, with the weakening of just environmental reviews, we're seeing that the same way with kind of our processes as well, and kind of the rollback of where those standards are in the same way.
Thank you. Laura? Let's unmute.
All right, there you go. Tangential to that, and some of what we discussed when you came over the other day and saw our historic passive house retrofit, is really, my main sort of focus, which is the building science that our entire industry needs to get up to speed on. And one of the main things related to standards, which, as I often say, the energy efficiency code should be called the health and durability code, and it might get some traction instead of raised eyebrows and rolling eyes. Um, so so how do we educate? And the preservation group, as we talked about, needs to know this because it will help prevent our buildings from crumbling from the inside out, right? So this internal cancer we create by changing the dynamics of the building, by starting to insulate a wall that was never intended to be insulated, creates problems. And so the building science is even more important in the preservation world, or certainly equally to the new building world, so that we, don't inadvertently actually accelerate the deterioration of our buildings. So if you would speak to that, and what strategies do you think we can do?
Yeah, Laura, I think you're absolutely correct. And I think, a lot of times, we have this field of architectural conservationists that come in a lot of time after the building is already decayed. They're coming in when there's spalling or things like this. They're coming in after a natural disaster and they're trying to fix, retroactively. And I really think you're so spot on about this idea of being proactive and thinking about how to get the building science framework and that point of view integrated into more proactive architectural conservation, I think is exactly what we need. And I think it all really boils down to education. I think architects need to understand that they need to hear from people like you, Laura, who have this knowledge, and that needs to come down to, how they write the specs. Same with the contractors who are actually doing the work, making sure that they don't inadvertently, install something wrong that has negative implications on the building. And I really think it is, just a major education push to show that these are the same thing. They're not separate things. This is how we preserve our buildings, is through understanding building systems and building science. And if we can kind of reframe preservation and thinking that way, I think, like I said, a lot of times preservationists, think about more so aesthetics or history, and that is extremely important, especially around cultural history. But at the same time, if you want that building to stand for another 100 years, we need to make sure that we're not, fast tracking brick spalling. So yeah, I continue to look forward to talking about education strategies and what that looks like together.
Um, so finally, we did mention that I have been trying to build a coalition of people around a sustainability toolkit. And Preservation Alliance has amazing toolkits about all kinds of parts of the process. And it seems like a logical one. And that would be a collaborative process that would include probably Green Building United and AIA Coat and the Building Envelope Committee kind of thing, to put sort of what are the basic steps, procedures, what are the questions you need to ask early on, where do you need special consultants, and then some differential between a row house, which might reference the row house manual from Green Building United, to larger buildings, to churches, synagogues, kind of thing. And I just I'm sending you the Hotel Marcel, thinking of the Roundhouse. Since that passive house retrofit of that kind of a early modern building is really seminal in terms of economics, so viable, both economically, environmentally, socially, culturally, preserving this great building. So, getting the news out, getting the awareness out, and dispelling the mythology about that you can't really do it, you'll hurt your building if you try to make it sustainable, is just needs building science facts to help, and case studies to show that it's not true.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Laura. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Maybe we should call it health and durability toolkits. But anyone else want to just speak up? Just unmute yourself and
Hey, I'm driving. This is Samina. Laura, thank you for inviting me. Hannah, I really enjoyed your discussion. I think what strikes me is that the federal tax credit, as you mentioned, has to be for a building that's income producing, and that in effect does not include residential houses. And what the issue is that if we're talking about housing affordability and the some of the data that you provided, where that impact of low income housing being that there's this building stock that can be retrofitted. The issue is that we know from building science that to get the biggest gains, and Paul said something about not the short term sort of fixes, but the big envelope gains. When we talk about passive house, we're talking about making the envelope robust and not doing it in a way that makes it more susceptible to mold and is moisture. We have to do that carefully, and because it's historic, usually from the inside, which means that people need to move out, and this is difficult work that requires, just from a constructability point of view, dumpsters on the street, on small streets that are difficult for site logistics. And so without, when I talk to clients, potential clients about the possibility of doing this to their projects, they're curious. They want to do this type of work. They love the health implications. They love the comfort implications. They love the implications of having a better performance and saving and operating costs going forward. But that initial cost, whether we want to talk, the embodied carbon question is absolutely, we recognize the value of that embodied carbon, as especially the beauty of historic brick or other materials. But yet, homeowners are generally not in a position, and especially the income that we're talking about, are not in a position to rip down their houses from the inside. Energy retro and the long-term lasting thing that in funding or state funding, there needs to be a conversation that matches the things that have been discussed, that there's a potential to have this sort of housing at a really important price point, that there is so many buildings in Philadelphia itself could benefit from this. And yet there's, the housing funding that's available, basic systems repair, those are going to do repairs for in kind, like your boiler is broken, you're going to get a gas boiler. Your roof is, leaking, so you're going to get the same roof. It's not going to fund the type of retrofits that we know are going to lead to long-term lasting improvement on a global scale or on a citywide scale for better performance. And so what I would really like to see is some help. And middle income is a big question, because people who are curious and motivated to do this kind of work are generally not the lowest income. There should be more money for that. But there should be money for the people who are motivated, but cannot withstand, what it actually requires. Is it doable? Yes, it is doable, but it requires a big sacrifice and sometimes very disruptive for maybe a short amount of time, maybe 1.5, 2 months, 3 months. But people need housing. People need temporary housing. They need to have site logistics. And so I would really like to see some sort of funding that is forward thinking and really recognizes these facts and reconciles this. Because if we continue to say, okay, we're going to give money to, income producing buildings, then that's really that's really not going to help this majority that requires this. So that's what I'm.
Thanks, Samina. I think we can, Hanna, can you address that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on in identifying that major gap right now. Very limited incentives are out there and resources, direct monetary resources to support homeowners. And especially, there's nothing that exists right now at the state, city, or federal level that can, give monetary resources to an owner of a historic home. And that has been something that the Preservation Alliance has been advocating for many years. We've had some success in getting a bill introduced in the state house that would replicate the state historic tax credit for homeowners. But again, that's never passed out of the state house. There's definitely interest, but not enough. But I think you're so spot on that there is so much attention right now, whether you're at the city or the state level, in funding home owner focused repair work. And I don't think there has been enough focus on, the middle income, as well as forward thinking new strategies to preserve these buildings longer term. And I think that at the Alliance, we are not a grant making organization, but we are constantly thinking about how we can advocate for those policies at the city and state level. And I really appreciate how you phrased a lot of that. And I'm going to take that back to kind of how I speak about this, because you're so correct. It's a major gap, and we're not going to solve this if we only focus on commercial buildings, because we know literally through the data that we just talked about, we have so much residential building, and housing affordability is such a crisis facing us right now. So I really appreciate how you put that. I think that's going to really help our advocacy efforts.